She was discarded like broken glass for being too fragile to survive the frontier, until a towering Cheyenne warrior saw unbreakable steel beneath her delicate frame and built her a sanctuary that would become the foundation of a love story that defied two worlds. The Colorado Territory in the autumn of 1875 was a place where only the strong survived, and weakness was a luxury that could cost a person their life. The town of Cedar Ridge clung to the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains like a desperate prayer, its wooden buildings weathered gray by howling winds and punishing winters.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Here, in this harsh landscape where survival demanded iron will and stronger bodies, lived a young woman who possessed neither, or so the world believed. Isadora Crane, called Izzy by the few who showed her kindness, stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than a sack of grain. Her frame was so delicate that strong winds seemed to bend her like a willow branch, and her pale skin bore the translucent quality of someone who had battled illness and lost more than she had won. The fever that had nearly claimed her life at age 12 had left her with lungs that struggled for air in the thin mountain atmosphere and bones that seemed to fracture at the slightest provocation. In a world where women were expected to birth children as hardy as mountain goats and work from dawn to dusk without complaint, Izzy appeared to be nature's cruel joke, a porcelain doll placed in a world of granite and steel. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge as Izzy made her way to Henderson's general store, her worn leather shoes barely making a sound on the wooden planks. Her basket contained the delicate lacework she had spent weeks creating by lamplight, each stitch a testament to the one skill her frail hands had mastered. Mrs. Henderson had promised to consider her work for the store, though Izzy suspected it was more out of pity than genuine interest. As she pushed open the heavy door, the familiar scent of tobacco, leather, and preserved goods greeted her, along with the whispered conversations that always seemed to follow her presence. "There goes Crane's sickly daughter," muttered Jake Morrison, the town's blacksmith, his voice carrying the weight of dismissal. "Still trying to make herself useful, I see." His companion, Bill Rawlings, who owned a livery stable, shook his head with apparent sympathy. "That girl's been dying since the day she was born. Her pa should have sent her back east to family years ago, before she becomes a burden on the whole town." The words cut through Izzy like winter wind, but she kept her chin raised, her steps steady despite the tremor in her hands. Mrs. Henderson, a stout woman with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing, examined Izzy's lacework with the scrutiny of an appraiser. The intricate pattern spoke of countless hours spent hunched over needle and thread, creating beauty from mere string through sheer determination. "It's fine work, dear," she said finally, though her tone suggested reluctance. "But I'm afraid the demand for such delicate items isn't strong in a mining town. The women here need practical things, sturdy cloth, work gloves, boots that won't wear through in a month. Pretty things are for places where people have time to appreciate them." The rejection landed like a physical blow, but Izzy simply nodded, gathering her work with hands that shook only slightly. Outside the store, Izzy paused to catch her breath, the thin mountain air making her chest tight. The autumn wind carried the scent of snow from the high peaks, a reminder that winter would come early and stay late in this unforgiving land. As she stood there, trying to summon the strength to continue her day, she overheard a conversation that would haunt her for weeks to come. "The Crane girl's becoming a real problem," said Mayor Thomas Whitfield, his voice carrying the authority of his office. He stood with Dr. Samuel Pierce and Reverend Jonathan Hayes, 3 of the town's most influential men. "She can't work like other women, can't contribute to the community's welfare. Her father's getting on in years, and when he passes, she become a ward of the town. We can't afford to support someone who gives nothing back." Dr. Pierce nodded grimly, his medical bag clutched in his weathered hands. I've examined her multiple times. Her constitution is fundamentally weak. The altitude here is slowly killing her, and there's nothing to be done about it." Reverend Hayes, normally a man of compassion, seemed to struggle with his next words. Perhaps it would be kinder to encourage her to seek opportunities elsewhere. Places more suited to her. Limitations, the word struck Izzy like physical blows, each one confirming her worst fears about her place in this harsh world. She pressed herself against the store's wooden wall, hoping to remain invisible as the conversation continued. Mayor Whitfield's voice grew more decisive. "The territorial government is offering homestead opportunities to families willing to establish settlements further west. Perhaps we could encourage the Cranes to consider such an option. A fresh start in a place where they might find better opportunities." The euphemism was clear to everyone present. They wanted her gone, removed from their community, like a diseased limb. Dr. Pierce stroked his beard thoughtfully. "The girl's condition isn't contagious, but it is hereditary. If she were to marry and have children, she could pass on her weakness to the next generation. From a medical standpoint, it might be better for everyone if she remained unmarried." The casual discussion of her future, as if she were livestock to be evaluated and disposed of, filled Izzy with a mixture of rage and despair. She had always known she was considered a burden, but hearing it discussed so clinically by the men who led her community was a new form of cruelty. Reverend Hayes, perhaps sensing the harshness of their words, attempted to soften the blow. "Of course, we must approach this with Christian charity. The girl isn't responsible for her condition, and we shouldn't punish her for God's will. But we must also consider our responsibility to the community as a whole. Resources are limited, and we need to make decisions that benefit the greatest number of people." His words, meant to be compassionate, only underscored the fundamental truth that Izzy had always known but never faced so directly. In a world where survival depended on strength, she was a luxury the community could no longer afford. That evening, Izzy sat in the small cabin she shared with her father, Marcus Crane, watching him work by lamplight. Once a skilled carpenter and one of the town's more prosperous citizens, Marcus had spent the last 7 years devoting most of his time and energy to caring for his fragile daughter. His hands, once steady enough to craft the finest furniture in the territory, now trembled slightly from exhaustion and worry. The cost of her medical care and the time lost from his work had slowly drained their savings, leaving them dependent on the charity of neighbors who were growing increasingly reluctant to help. "Pa," Izzy said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I heard Mayor Whitfield talking today. They want us to leave town." Marcus looked up from the chair leg he was sanding, his weathered face creased with concern. "What did you hear, sweetheart?" The endearment, used since her childhood, now carried the weight of protective desperation. Izzy recounted the conversation, watching as her father's expression shifted from surprise to anger to resignation. "They're probably right," he said. Finally, his voice heavy with defeat. "This altitude is hard on your lungs, and the winters keep getting worse. Maybe it's time we considered moving to a place where you might have a better chance." The admission that her own father believed she couldn't survive in the place she called home was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. Marcus Crane had been her champion, her protector, the one person who had never questioned her right to exist in this harsh world. To hear him now accepting the town's assessment of her as a burden was like watching her last defender lay down his sword. "I don't want to be the reason you have to leave everything you've built," Izzy said, her voice breaking. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I should just accept that I'm not meant for this life." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but they reflected the growing certainty that she was fighting a battle she could never win. Marcus set down his tools and moved to his daughter's side, taking her small hands in his calloused ones. "Don't you ever say that," he said fiercely. "You're my daughter, and you belong wherever I am. If we have to leave, we'll leave together. But I won't have you believing that you're worth less than anyone else in this town." His words were meant to comfort, but they only highlighted the impossible situation they faced.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Her weakness had become his burden, and his love for her was slowly destroying the life he had built. The weight of that knowledge settled on Izzy's shoulders like a physical burden. One more thing her frail frame would have to carry. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A messenger arrived in Cedar Ridge with word that the territorial government was offering subsidized passage to California for families willing to relocate. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as an opportunity for a fresh start, while others viewed it as abandonment of the life they had built in Colorado. For Izzy, it represented both salvation and defeat, a chance to escape the judgment of her community, but also an admission that she was too weak to survive. In the place she called home, Mayor Whitfield wasted no time in approaching Marcus Crane about the opportunity. "It's a generous offer," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The climate in California would be better for your daughter's health, and there are opportunities there for skilled craftsmen like yourself. The territorial government would pay for your passage and provide a small settlement fund to help you establish yourself." The subtext was clear. They wanted her gone, and they were willing to pay for the privilege. Marcus listened politely, but his eyes held a growing anger that his daughter had never seen before. "You're asking me to abandon my home because my daughter is sick," Marcus said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. "To take charity from the government and disappear so you don't have to look at her anymore." Mayor Whitfield had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That's not how I would put it, Marcus. This is about opportunities, about giving your daughter a chance at a better life. The altitude here is killing her slowly, and we all know it. In California, she might have a chance to recover, to find a place where she can contribute something meaningful." The words were meant to be kind, but they carried the sting of fundamental rejection. That afternoon, as Izzy walked through the town that had been her entire world, she saw it through new eyes. The pitying glances from the women, the way men looked through her as if she were invisible, the children who were hushed when she passed, all of it suddenly seemed unbearable. She had spent her entire life trying to prove she belonged here, trying to find ways to contribute despite her limitations. Now she understood that it had been a futile effort from the beginning. This place would never accept her, never see her as anything more than a burden to be managed or preferably removed. As Izzy sat on a boulder at the edge of town, watching the sun set behind the mountain peaks, she didn't notice the figure watching her from the tree line. Red Hawk, known to his people as Mapnetsi, had been observing the town of Cedar Ridge for several days, studying the routines and weaknesses of the settlement. The Cheyenne warrior stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, his powerful frame moving with the silent grace of a predator. His mission was reconnaissance. The nearby cavalry had been raiding Cheyenne camps, and his war chief wanted to know if the town posed a threat. But as Red Hawk watched the small figure sitting alone in the growing darkness, something stirred in his chest that had nothing to do with war or strategy. The woman's posture spoke of profound sadness, of a spirit that had been broken by forces beyond her control. Even from a distance, he could see the delicate nature of her frame, the way she seemed to fold in on herself as if trying to disappear from the world. In his culture, the weak were protected, not discarded, and the sight of this obviously suffering woman sitting alone touched something deep in his warrior's heart. Red Hawk had lost his own sister to the white man's diseases, watching helplessly as she wasted away despite his people's best efforts to save her. The memory of her death had driven him to become one of the most feared warriors in his band, but it had also given him a deep understanding of what it meant to be fragile in a world that demanded strength. As he watched Izzy sitting in the gathering darkness, he saw not weakness but a kind of quiet courage that his people would honor, the strength to continue existing in a world that had made it clear she was not wanted. The warrior remained hidden in the shadows, his presence as undetectable as that of a hunting cat. But his eyes never left the small figure by the boulder, and something in his heart began to shift. He had come to Cedar Ridge as a scout, but he was beginning to suspect that the Great Spirit had guided him here for a different purpose entirely. The woman's obvious pain called to something protective in his nature, something that had been dormant since his sister's death. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Red Hawk made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Tomorrow, he would reveal himself. Tonight, he would watch over her from the shadows, ensuring that nothing threatened this fragile creature who had somehow captured his warrior's heart. The irony was not lost on him. He had come to assess whether this town was a threat to his people, but instead he had found someone who appeared to be more threatened by her own community than any enemy could be. In the darkness of the Colorado wilderness, two souls destined for each other remained separated by mere yards and an entire world of difference. As the first light of dawn touched the mountain peaks, Izzy rose from her sleepless vigil and began the walk back to town. She had spent the night making a decision that felt like surrender, but might actually be the beginning of her salvation. She would tell her father that she was willing to consider the move to California, that she understood. Her presence in Cedar Ridge was becoming untenable. The admission tasted like defeat, but it was also a recognition of reality. She could not change what she was, and she could not force a community to accept what it saw as weakness. What she didn't know was that less than 100 yards away, a towering Cheyenne warrior was making his own decision. Red Hawk had spent the night watching over her, and in those quiet hours, he had seen something that the people of Cedar Ridge had missed entirely. Her weakness was not the absence of strength, it was strength of a different kind, the kind that endured suffering without breaking, that faced rejection without becoming bitter. It was the strength his people called Vuxi, the power to bend without breaking, to survive what would destroy others. As Izzy disappeared into the morning mist, Red Hawk began to formulate a plan that would shock both their worlds. He would not simply observe this woman from afar, he would act. The white settlement had rejected her, but perhaps she would find acceptance in a place where different kinds of strength were valued. His people had laws about taking captives, but they also had customs about protecting those who could not protect themselves. The warrior's heart told him that this fragile woman possessed something precious that her own people were too blind to see. The morning that would change everything had begun, though neither Izzy nor Red Hawk yet understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. In a few hours, two worlds would collide in a way that would challenge everything both had believed about strength, weakness, and the power of love to transcend the boundaries that divided peoples. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the true meaning of courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to risk everything for something greater than oneself. The sun rose blood red over the Colorado peaks, painting the sky in shades of warning and promise. Izzy Crane woke before dawn, her body racked with the familiar cough that had plagued her since childhood. The conversation with her father the night before had left her with a decision that felt like swallowing poison. She would agree to leave Cedar Ridge, to accept the government's offer of passage to California. But first, she needed to say goodbye to the only place she had ever called home, to walk once more through the wilderness that had been both her prison and her sanctuary. She dressed quietly in her worn brown dress and heavy woolen shawl, careful not to wake her father, who had finally fallen asleep after hours of worried pacing. The cabin felt smaller than ever, cramped with the weight of unspoken fears and the growing certainty that their time here was ending. Izzy slipped out into the crisp morning air, her breath forming small clouds in the cold as she made her way toward the mountain trail that led to her favorite thinking spot, a small meadow surrounded by aspens where she had spent countless hours dreaming of a different life. The trail was steep and rocky, challenging even for someone with strong lungs and steady legs. For Izzy, it was a test of will over weakness. each step a small victory against the body that had betrayed her since birth. She paused frequently to catch her breath, her chest tight with the effort of drawing air into lungs that seemed to work. At half capacity, the morning mist clung to the mountainside like ghostly fingers, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the call of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. What she didn't know was that she was being watched. Red Hawk had spent the night in the forest, his warrior's training allowing him to remain motionless for hours while observing his surroundings. He had seen her emerge from the small cabin, had watched her struggle with each step up the mountain trail, and something in his chest had tightened with an emotion he couldn't quite name. This was not the way his people treated their weak, this isolation, this abandonment to face hardship alone. Halfway up the trail, Izzy's strength finally gave out. The combination of the altitude, the emotional exhaustion from the previous day, and her body's fundamental frailty created a perfect storm of weakness. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest intensify, her vision beginning to blur as her lungs struggled to extract oxygen from the thin mountain air. She stumbled, her hands reaching out desperately for something to break her fall, but finding only empty air. The world spun around her as she collapsed onto the rocky path, her body crumpling like a discarded doll. The impact sent sharp pain through her already fragile ribs, and she lay there gasping like a fish out of water, unable to draw enough breath to call for help even if there had been anyone to hear her. The morning sun that had seen so beautiful moments before now felt harsh and unforgiving, beating down on her prone form as she struggled against the panic that always accompanied these episodes. From his concealed position 50 yards away, Red Hawk watched the woman fall with the swift grace of a hunting cat. His warrior's instincts kicked in immediately, assessing the situation with the clarity that had kept him alive through countless battles. She was in distress, possibly dying, and there was no one else around to help her. The decision to reveal himself was not a choice. It was an imperative written in the very core of his being. He moved through the forest like a shadow made flesh, his massive frame somehow finding silence despite his size. Years of hunting and warfare had taught him to move without disturbing so much as a fallen leaf, and he used every bit of that skill now as he approached the fallen woman. She lay curled on her side, her face pale as winter snow, her breathing shallow and labored. Up close, he could see the delicate bone structure that spoke of aristocratic breeding, the fine features that would have been considered beautiful in any setting where weakness was not a crime. Red Hawk knelt beside Izzy's prone form, his warrior's hands surprisingly gentle as he assessed her condition. He had seen men die in battle, had watched friends succumb to wounds and disease, but there was something about this woman's fragility that struck him differently. She was not injured by war or accident, she was simply too delicate for the world she had been born into, like a flower trying to bloom in the shadow of a glacier. Naise, he whispered in Cheyenne, the word meaning little bird in the gentle tone reserved for children and the wounded. His voice, though soft, seemed to penetrate Izzy's consciousness, and her eyes fluttered open to find herself staring into the face of a man unlike any she had ever seen. His features were strong and angular, carved from bronze and shadow, with eyes the color of midnight that seemed to hold depths of understanding she had never encountered. Izzy's first instinct was terror. She had heard stories of Indian raids, of settlers captured and tortured, of the savage nature of the native tribes that roamed these mountains. But as she looked into Red Hawk's eyes, she saw not the cruel bloodlust she had been taught to expect, but something else entirely: concern, gentleness, and a kind of protective strength that made her feel safer than she had in years. His presence should have terrified her, but instead, it felt like the answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. "You are hurt," Red Hawk said in carefully pronounced English, his accent thick but his words clear. He had learned the white man's language from traders and missionaries, though he rarely had occasion to use it. "I help you." It was not a question but a statement of fact. delivered with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. His hands, large enough to span her entire back, moved with surprising delicacy as he helped her sit up, supporting her weight as if she were made of spun glass. Red Hawk's knowledge of healing came from his grandmother, a medicine woman who had taught him that true strength lay not in the ability to deal death, but in the power to preserve life. He studied Izzy's face with the intensity of a healer reading symptoms, noting the blue tinge around her lips that spoke of oxygen deprivation, the way her breathing came in short, desperate gasps. Without a word, he reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Inside the bundle were herbs that his people had used for generations to treat breathing ailments: wild cherry bark, coltsfoot, and a rare mountain plant that grew only at high altitudes. He had carried these medicines with him not for himself, but out of habit, the way a warrior always carried the tools of his trade. Now as he looked at this struggling woman, he understood why the Great Spirit had guided him to bring them. "This will help," he said, crushing the leaves between his palms to release their healing oils. The scent was sharp and clean, like breathing liquid sunlight. "Breathe deep." He held his cupped hands beneath her nose, and Izzy found herself inhaling the strange but somehow comforting fragrance. Within moments, she felt her airways beginning to clear, her breathing becoming easier as the natural medicines worked their ancient magic. The relief was so immediate and profound that tears began to roll down Izzy's cheeks. For the first time in months, she could draw a full breath without pain, could feel oxygen flowing freely through her lungs. "How did you?" she began, but Red Hawk silenced her with a gentle gesture. "Save strength," he said simply. "Healing takes time." His English was limited, but his meaning was clear, and something in his tone suggested that he understood her condition better than the town doctor who had examined her countless times. What happened next defied everything Izzy had been taught about Indians and their savage nature. Red Hawk didn't simply help her to her feet and abandon her. He took responsibility for her welfare with the dedication of a guardian angel. When she proved too weak to stand on her own, he lifted her as easily as a child might lift a doll, cradling her against his chest with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone of his size and apparent strength. "Where you go?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that she felt as much as heard. Izzy pointed weakly toward the meadow higher up the trail, and Red Hawk nodded as if this made perfect sense. He began to climb the steep path with her in his arms, his powerful legs carrying both their weight with an ease that spoke of incredible physical conditioning. His breathing remained steady and controlled, while hers slowly returned to something approaching normal. The sensation of being carried was entirely foreign to Izzy, who had spent her entire life struggling to move under her own power. In Red Hawk's arms, she felt weightless, protected, as if she were being transported by some benevolent force of nature rather than a man. His heartbeat was strong and steady against her cheek, and she found herself relaxing into his embrace with a trust that surprised her. This stranger, this supposed enemy, was treating her with more care than her own community had shown in years. When they reached the meadow, Red Hawk set her down gently on a fallen log that had been weathered smooth by years of mountain weather. The spot commanded a sweeping view of the valley below, where Cedar Ridge looked like a collection of children's blocks scattered across the landscape. From this height, the town that had rejected her seemed small and insignificant, dwarfed by the majesty of the mountains that surrounded it. Red Hawk settled himself on the ground nearby, his massive frame somehow managing to look graceful even. In repose, he watched Izzy with the patience of a hunter, noting the way color was slowly returning to her cheeks, the way her breathing was becoming more natural. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had chosen his words. "Carefully, your people," he said, gesturing toward the town below. "They do not see your strength." It was a statement rather than a question, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. Izzy looked at him in surprise. startled by the accuracy of his observation. "They see only weakness," he continued. "But I see something else. I see Vuxa, the strength that bends but does not break. My people honor this strength." The word was foreign to Izzy, but something in the way he said it made her understand that it was not a casual observation, but a recognition of something profound. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice still weak but gaining strength. Red Hawk was quiet for a long moment, as if searching for the right words in a language that was not his own. "Tree on mountain," he said finally, pointing to a gnarled pine that clung to the rocky slope above them. "Wind tries to break it, snow tries to kill it, but it lives. Not because it is strong like oak, but because it knows how to survive what would destroy others. This is Vuxi. This is what you have." His eyes met hers directly, and in them she saw a kind of recognition that she had never encountered before. Not pity, not dismissal, but genuine respect, emboldened by his words and the strange safety she felt in his presence. Izzy began to tell Red Hawk about her life in Cedar Ridge. She spoke of the fever that had nearly killed her, of the years of struggling to find her place in a community that valued only physical strength, of the constant awareness that she was seen as a burden rather than a blessing. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam, all the pain and loneliness she had carried in silence. Finally finding voice, Red Hawk listened with the attention of someone who understood that bearing witness to pain was itself a form of healing. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the distant mountains. Then he began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of his own sorrows. "I had sister," he said slowly. "She was like you, not strong in body, but strong in spirit. When white man's sickness came to our village, she was first to fall ill. I tried to save her, brought every medicine, called every healer. But she died in my arms, and I could do nothing." His voice broke slightly on the Wendy last words, and Izzy saw a depth of pain in his eyes that matched her own. "The warriors blamed me," he continued. "Said I spent too much time caring for weak one, not enough time becoming strong. They said her death was teaching from Great Spirit, that weak must die so strong can live. But I know they were wrong. My sister had gift, could speak to animals, could find water in drought, could heal hearts with her songs. When she died, our people lost something precious, but they were too blind to see it." As Red Hawk spoke, Izzy began to understand that she was not alone in her struggle against a world that failed to recognize different kinds of strength. This towering warrior, who could probably kill a dozen men with his bare hands, had also been marked by his love for someone the world considered weak. The parallel was not lost on either of them, two people from different worlds, bound by the understanding that strength came in many forms. "Why are you telling me this?" Izzy asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Red Hawk's smile was sad but genuine, transforming his fierce features into something almost tender. "Because when I saw you fall, I saw her again. And I knew Great Spirit had brought me here not to scout for war, but to find something I had lost. Someone who needs protection, someone who deserves to be valued for what she is, not scorned for what she is not." The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Izzy felt her heart racing, not from exertion this time, but from the recognition of something she had never dared to hope for: acceptance, understanding, and perhaps something even more precious. This man, this stranger who should have been her enemy, saw her not as a burden but as someone worth protecting. "My people have law," Red Hawk said carefully. "If someone is cast out by their tribe, another tribe can offer sanctuary. You are cast out, yes? Your people want you gone?" Izzy nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Then I offer you choice. Come with me to my people. Live where weakness is not crime, where different strengths are honored. You will be under my protection, and no one will harm you." The offer was so unexpected, so far beyond anything Izzy had imagined possible, that she could only stare at him in amazement. Leave everything she had ever known to live among Indians? The very idea should have terrified her, but instead, she felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. Here was a man who saw her as she truly was, who offered not just protection but acceptance. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." Red Hawk's expression grew serious, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "I know enough. I know you have courage to climb mountain even when body says no. I know you have kindness. You could have screamed when you saw me, brought soldiers, caused trouble for my people. But you did not. You listened, you trusted. This tells me who you are inside." The truth of his words struck Izzy like a physical blow. She had trusted him, had felt safe in his presence from the very first moment. Her own actions had revealed something about her character that she had never recognized. She possessed a kind of instinctive wisdom that looked beyond surface appearances to the truth beneath. Perhaps this was another form of strength, one that her community had failed to value. "But your people," she said, grasping for objections that might make sense of this impossible situation. "Surely they wouldn't accept a white woman, especially one who is weak and sickly." Red Hawk's smile was gentle but confident. "My people judge by actions, not appearance. You show them same courage you show me, same kindness, and they will see what I see. And you will not be weak there. Our medicine is strong. Our ways are different. You will learn to be strong in new ways." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Red Hawk knew that he would have to return to his people soon. The scouting mission that had brought him to Cedar Ridge would not wait much longer for his report. But he also knew that he could not simply walk away from this fragile woman, who had somehow captured his warrior's heart. She represented everything he had failed to protect in his sister, everything he had lost when the white man's diseases had ravaged his village. "I must go soon," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "But I will not go alone. The choice is yours, Knees. Come with me and live as someone valued, or stay and let your people send you away to die slowly in a strange land. But know this, if you come with me, you will never be weak again. You will be under protection of Red Hawk, and I have never failed to protect what is mine." The possessive note in his voice should have alarmed Izzy, but instead, it filled her with a warmth she had never experienced. To be claimed by someone, to be considered worth protecting, it was a gift beyond price. She looked down at Cedar Ridge, at the town that had made it clear she was not welcome, then back at this incredible man who offered her a different kind of life entirely. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "what would that mean? Would I be a prisoner? A slave?" Red Hawk's expression grew fierce at the suggestion. "You would be under my protection," he said firmly. "In my people's way, that makes you family. You would have place in tribe, purpose, respect. No one would dare harm you or treat you as less than human. This I promise with my life." The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice than a recognition of inevitable truth. Izzy had spent her entire life trying to find her place in a world that rejected her, fighting to prove herself worthy of acceptance that would never come. Now suddenly, she was being offered exactly what she had always wanted, a place where she could belong, where her differences would be seen as strengths rather than weaknesses. "I'll come with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with determination. "I don't know what kind of life awaits me, but it can't be worse than what I'm leaving behind. And if you're willing to take the risk of bringing me to your people, then I'm willing to take the risk of going with you." Red Hawk's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming his entire face with its intensity. "You will not regret this choice," he said, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "I will make sure of it." He extended his hand to help her up, and as their fingers touched, Izzy felt a jolt of connection that had nothing to do with physical contact. Something fundamental had shifted between them, a bond forged in the crucible of mutual understanding and shared pain. As they prepared to leave the meadow, Red Hawk paused and looked back at Cedar Ridge one last time. The town had rejected this precious woman, had cast her aside as worthless, but their loss would be his people's gain. He would take her home, help her heal, and show her what it meant to be valued for who she was, rather than condemned for what she wasn't. The white settlement below would never know what treasure they had thrown away. The morning sun was now high overhead, burning away the last of the mist and revealing the mountain landscape in all its harsh beauty. As Red Hawk and Izzy began their descent toward an uncertain but hopeful future, both felt the weight of destiny settling around them like a mantle. They were no longer just two individuals from different worlds. They were partners in a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about strength, weakness, and the power of love to transcend every boundary. The path down from the meadow was treacherous, made more dangerous by Izzy's weakened state and the weight of the decision she had just made. Red Hawk moved ahead of her, his massive frame somehow finding sure footing on the loose, scree and rocky outcroppings that would have challenged even a healthy climber. Every few steps, he would pause and extend his hand to guide her over particularly difficult sections, his touch gentle but firm, as if he were handling something infinitely precious. As they descended, Izzy caught glimpses of Cedar Ridge through the trees, and each sighting felt like looking at a life that was already becoming part of her past. The town that had been her entire world now seemed small and insignificant, a collection of buildings that had never truly been home. She thought of her father, probably just now discovering her absence, and felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly made her stumble. But then she remembered the resignation in his voice when he had agreed they should leave, and she knew that this choice, however painful, was the only one that offered any hope for a future. "Your father," Red Hawk said, as if reading her thoughts, "he will worry when you do not return." His English was becoming more fluid with use, and Izzy found herself hanging on every word, amazed by the depth of understanding in his voice. "We cannot leave him wondering if you are dead. This would be cruel." The fact that he was concerned about her father's feelings, that he understood the pain their departure would cause, only reinforced her growing conviction that she had made the right choice. They paused at a rocky outcropping that provided a clear view of the cabin where she had spent her entire life. Smoke was beginning to rise from the chimney, and Izzy could picture her father stoking the fire, preparing for another day of work that would be interrupted by the discovery of her absence. "I need to leave him a message," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Something to let him know I'm safe, that I chose this." Red Hawk nodded solemnly, understanding the importance of this gesture, even though it would delay their departure. Red Hawk waited patiently as Izzy composed her thoughts, then helped her find a suitable piece of bark to write on. Using a piece of charcoal from a long-dead fire, she began to write the most difficult letter of her life. Her hand shook as she formed the words, each letter a small act of courage that required her to break ties with everything she had ever known. "Dearest Pa," she wrote, her tears making the charcoal smear slightly. "By the time you read this, I will be gone. But please know that I am safe, and that I go willingly. The man who protects me is honorable and kind, and he has offered me something I never dared hope for, a place where I can belong. Do not come looking for me, for I am beyond your reach now, but do not grieve for me either. For the first time in my life, I am not a burden to be carried or a problem to be solved. I am simply someone who is valued for who I am. I will love you always, but I must find my own way now. Your devoted daughter, Izzy." Red Hawk watched her write with the respect of someone who understood that he was witnessing something sacred. When she finished, he helped her find a suitable rock to weight the message down, then guided her to a spot where her father would be sure to find it. The placement required them to get dangerously close to the cabin, close enough that they could hear Marcus moving around inside, preparing for a day that would bring him devastating news. As they crept through the morning shadows, Izzy felt the full weight of what she was leaving behind. This was not just a house, but the repository of all her memories, all the love and pain that had shaped her into the person she was becoming. The garden where she had tried to grow vegetables despite her weakness, the workshop where she had watched her father craft furniture with hands that had grown unsteady from worry about her, the small room where she had spent countless nights, dreaming of a different life. All of it was about to become part of a past she could never reclaim. They had almost reached the hiding place where Red Hawk had left his horse when disaster struck. Thomas Morrison, the blacksmith's son, and one of the young men who had tormented Izzy throughout her childhood, was returning from an early hunting trip when he spotted them through the trees. His shout of alarm shattered the morning stillness. Like a gunshot, and suddenly the peaceful forest erupted into chaos. "Indian! There's an Indian with the Crane girl!" Thomas's voice carried clearly through the thin mountain air, and within moments, other voices began to respond from the direction of the town. Red Hawk's entire body went rigid with tension, his hand instinctively moving to the war hatchet at his belt. This was the moment he had hoped to avoid, the confrontation that could turn their escape into a bloodbath. "Run," he said urgently, but Izzy was already struggling to keep up with their normal pace. The idea of running was impossible for someone whose lungs barely functioned in the thin air. "I cannot," she gasped, her face already pale with exertion. "Leave me and save yourself." But Red Hawk's response was immediate and fierce. "I do not abandon what is mine," he said, and before she could protest, he had swept her up into his arms and was moving through the forest with a speed that seemed to defy physics. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder. Thomas Morrison had apparently run back to town to raise the alarm, and now a growing crowd of armed men was crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. Izzy could hear her father's voice among them, calling her name with a desperation that broke her heart. But she could also hear other voices, harder voices, calling for the Indian's blood and speaking of her as if she were already dead. Red Hawk moved through the forest like a force of nature, his powerful legs carrying them both over terrain that would have challenged a man traveling alone. His breathing remained steady despite the burden he carried, and Izzy marveled at the sheer physical capability that allowed him to run while holding her as if she weighed nothing at all. This was what true strength looked like, not the brutal force that her community valued, but the kind of power that could protect and preserve what was precious. The pursuit behind them was growing more organized, and Izzy could hear the sound of horses being brought into play. Cedar Ridge might be a small town, but it was populated by frontiersmen who knew how to track and hunt, and they were not going to give up easily. "They'll catch us," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of their passage through the forest. "There are too many of them, and they know this land as well as you do." But Red Hawk's response was a grim smile that spoke of resources his pursuers could not imagine. "They know white man's trails," he said, his voice steady despite their desperate flight. "I know paths that have been hidden since before their grandfathers were born. Trust me, knees. We will not be caught." As if to prove his point, he suddenly veered off the main trail and plunged into what appeared to be impenetrable undergrowth. But the barrier was an illusion. Behind the screen of branches lay a narrow game trail that had been used by animals for generations. The path was invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look, and it led in a direction that would take them away from the obvious escape routes. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the sounds of pursuit began to fade, replaced by the natural sounds of the forest birds calling, branches creaking in the wind, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. For the first time since the chase began, Izzy allowed herself to believe that they might actually escape after what felt like hours of travel. Red Hawk finally slowed his pace and set Izzy down beside a small stream that burbled merrily through a valley she had never seen before. The place was like something from a fairy tale, a hidden meadow surrounded by towering pines, with crystal clear water and grass so green it seemed to glow in the filtered sunlight. It was the kind of place that made you believe in magic, in the possibility that the world held secrets more wonderful than anything you had imagined. "We rest here," Red Hawk said, kneeling by the stream to cup water in his hands. "Your people will not find this place. It is sacred to my tribe, protected by spirits they do not understand." He offered her the water, and she drank gratefully, the cold liquid soothing her parched throat and helping to clear her head. For the first time since the chase began, she felt safe enough to truly consider what had just happened. "I can never go back," she said, the reality of her situation finally hitting her with full force. "Even if I wanted to, they'll think I was kidnapped, that I'm dead, or worse. My father will live the rest of his life wondering what happened to me." The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable, and she felt tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. She had gained her freedom, but at a cost that seemed almost too high to bear. Red Hawk settled beside her on the soft grass, his presence a comforting anchor in the storm of her emotions. "Your father loves you," he said simply. "He will grieve, yes, but he will also understand. A man who truly loves does not want to be the reason someone suffers. He will read your words and know that you found something better than what he could give you." The wisdom in his voice was gentle but certain, and Izzy found herself clinging to his words like a lifeline. As they rested in the hidden valley, Red Hawk began to tell Izzy more about his people and the life she was choosing. His descriptions painted a picture of a society that was completely different from anything she had known, a place where strength was valued, but not at the expense of compassion, where the weak were protected rather than discarded, where every person had a role to play regardless of their physical capabilities. "My grandmother is medicine woman," he said, his voice taking on a reverent tone. "She is old, her body is weak, but she is most honored person in our tribe. Her knowledge of healing plants, of the ways to speak with spirits, makes her more valuable than any warrior. When I bring you to her, she will teach you these things. You will learn to be strong in ways your people never imagined." The promise in his words was like a balm to her wounded spirit. "But what if your people don't accept me?" Izzy asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her heart. "What if they see me as their enemy, or as someone too weak to be of any value?" Red Hawk's response was immediate and fierce. "Then they will answer to me," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a warrior who had never backed down from a fight. "You are under my protection now, which means you are family. Anyone who harms you or treats you with disrespect will face my wrath." The protective intensity in his voice should have frightened her, but instead it filled her with a warmth she had never experienced. To be claimed by someone, to be considered worth fighting for, it was a gift beyond price. She looked at this incredible man who had risked everything to save her, and felt her heart begin to open in ways she had never thought possible. As the afternoon wore on, Red Hawk and Izzy talked more freely than either had ever talked to another person. The barriers of language and culture seemed to dissolve as they shared their stories, their fears, and their dreams for the future. Izzy spoke of her childhood battles with illness, of the loneliness of being different in a world that demanded conformity. Red Hawk told her of his training as a warrior, of the pressure to be strong and fierce when his nature was more gentle and protective. "I was not like other boys," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. "I was large and strong, but I did not enjoy fighting. I preferred to make things with my hands, to learn the healing arts from my grandmother. The other warriors mocked me, called me woman-hearted. It was only when my sister died that I became the fighter they wanted me to be. Anger made me cruel, and cruelty made me feared." The admission was clearly difficult for him, and Izzy felt honored that he would share something so personal. "But you're not cruel," she said softly. "You're the gentlest person I've ever met. You saved my life, protected me, offered me a home when my own people cast me out. That's not the action of a cruel man." Red Hawk's smile was sad but genuine. "You bring out the man I was meant to be," he said. "Before the anger, before the pain. With you, I remember what it feels like to protect rather than destroy." The conversation continued as the sun began to set, painting the hidden valley in shades of gold and crimson. They talked about their hopes for the future, about the life they might build together among his people. Red Hawk described the village where he had been born, with its hide lodges and sacred fires, its traditions that stretched back countless generations. Izzy tried to imagine herself in such a place, learning new ways of living, becoming part of a community that might actually value her contributions. As darkness fell, Red Hawk built a small fire using techniques that seemed to produce flame from nothing more than friction and tinder. The light danced across their faces as they shared a simple meal of dried meat and wild berries that he had gathered during their journey. The food was unlike anything Izzy had ever tasted, but it was satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with flavor and everything to do with the company. "Will they still be looking for us?" she asked, glancing back toward the direction they had come. Red Hawk nodded seriously. "For a while, yes. But they will not find us here, and eventually they will give up. Your people are not patient hunters, they expect quick results, and when they do not find what they seek, they lose interest." His confidence was reassuring, but Izzy could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the darkness beyond their small circle of light. "You should sleep," he said as the fire began to die down. "Tomorrow we begin the journey to my people, and it will be long and difficult. You will need your strength." He had fashioned a bed for her from pine boughs and his own blanket, and as she settled into the improvised nest, she felt safer than she had in years. Red Hawk took up a position where he could watch the approaches to their camp, his war hatchet within easy reach. But sleep was elusive for Izzy, who found herself watching the man who had become her protector. In the dying firelight, his features seemed carved from stone and shadow, noble and fierce, but somehow gentle at the same time. This was the face of someone who had chosen to risk everything for her, who had offered her a new life when her old one had become unbearable. The magnitude of his sacrifice was not lost on her, and she felt her heart beginning to open in ways she had never experienced. Near midnight, when the fire had died to glowing embers and the forest was silent except for the whisper of wind, through the pines Red Hawk spoke into the darkness. "I make you promise," he said, his voice soft but clear. "When we reach my people, you will not try to make yourself small to fit in. You will not hide your gifts or pretend to be less than you are. You will stand proud, as befits someone under my protection." The words were clearly important to him, and Izzy felt their weight settle over her like a mantle. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. "I've spent my whole life trying to be invisible, trying not to be a burden. I don't know how to be anything else." Red Hawk's response was immediate and fierce. "Then I will teach you," he said. "I will show you how to walk with pride, how to claim your place in the world. This is my promise to you." As she finally drifted off to sleep, Izzy felt something she had never experienced before, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears to overcome, but tonight she was safe in the care of someone who saw her not as a burden but as a treasure worth protecting. The girl who had been cast aside for being too weak was beginning to understand that weakness and strength were not opposites but partners in the dance of survival. The hidden valley slept around them, holding its secrets close, while overhead the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. In a few hours, they would begin the journey that would take Izzy away from everything she had ever known and toward a future she could not have imagined. But for now, in this moment of perfect peace, she was content to rest in the knowledge that she was no longer alone. 3 days of hard travel through mountain passes and hidden valleys had brought them to the edge of the Cheyenne encampment, and Izzy's first glimpse of Red Hawk's world took her breath away. The village nestled in a protected valley where a crystal stream wound between clusters of hide lodges, their painted surfaces telling stories and symbols she couldn't read, but somehow understood. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the sound of children's laughter carried on the wind. But as Red Hawk led her into the camp, all activity gradually ceased. The silence that fell over the village was different from the hostile whispers she had known in Cedar Ridge. This was the quiet of careful assessment, of people trying to understand what they were seeing. A white woman, obviously weak and sickly, being brought into their midst by one of their most respected warriors. The contradiction was so stark that it seemed to freeze everyone in place, creating a tableau of suspended judgment that made Izzy's heart race with anxiety. Red Hawk seemed to sense her fear, because his hand found hers and squeezed gently. "Walk proud," he murmured in English, his voice so low that only she could hear. "Show them the strength I know you possess." Then, switching to Cheyenne, he called out in a voice that carried clearly across the camp, "Nemahotats, Nemhivatas, Netahemahevathas." Even without understanding the words, Izzy could hear the authority in his tone, the unmistakable sound of a man who expected to be obeyed. An elderly woman emerged from the largest lodge, her gray hair braided with silver ornaments that caught the afternoon light. Despite her age, she moved with the fluid grace of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. And when her eyes met Izzy's, they held a depth of wisdom that seemed to see straight through to her soul. This had to be Red Hawk's grandmother, the medicine woman he had spoken of with such reverence. "Nezavahoz-hava," the old woman said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The crowd that had gathered around them shifted respectfully, creating a circle with Izzy and Red Hawk at its center. The sensation of being studied by dozens of pairs of eyes was overwhelming, but Izzy forced herself to stand straight, to meet their gazes with as much dignity as she could muster. These people would decide her fate, and she would not give them reason to think her unworthy of their consideration. Red Hawk stepped forward and began to speak in rapid Cheyenne, his voice carrying the passion of someone making a crucial argument. Though Izzy couldn't understand the words, she could follow the rhythm of his speech, the way he gestured toward her with obvious pride and protection. Several times she heard him say, "Nias," the word that meant little bird, and each time his voice grew gentler, more tender. The response from the crowd was immediate and divided. Some voices rose in what sounded like approval, while others carried clear notes of disagreement. A young warrior stepped forward, his face painted with red and black stripes that made him look fierce and intimidating. When he spoke, his words were sharp and challenging, and Izzy saw Red Hawk's jaw tighten with controlled anger. "He," the young warrior said, pointing directly at Izzy, "Veho, ara mahina, sesina statsa mahina." Though the words were foreign, the tone was unmistakable. This man was questioning her presence, challenging her right to be there. Other voices joined his, and Izzy felt the weight of their disapproval. Like a physical force, Red Hawk's response was immediate and fierce. He stepped in front of Izzy, his massive frame blocking her from the hostile gazes, and when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of a warrior who had never backed down from a fight. The exchange that followed was clearly heated, with gestures and raised voices that needed no translation. But gradually, the old woman's presence began to make itself felt. "Nahasest," she said, her voice cutting through the argument like a blade. The effect was immediate. All voices fell silent, and every eye turned to her with the respect due to someone whose wisdom was beyond question. She studied Izzy for a long moment, then stepped forward and began to walk slowly around her, as if examining a horse at market. The inspection was thorough and unnerving. The old woman's hands moved over Izzy's arms and shoulders, feeling the delicate bone structure, the lack of muscle that spoke of a lifetime of physical limitation. She listened to Izzy's breathing, noted the slight wheeze that betrayed her damaged Lungs felt the tremor in her hands that came from exhaustion and fear. But when she looked into Izzy's eyes, something in her expression changed. "Mata hivatasi," the old woman said finally, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "Hova han hatsamahina." The crowd stirred at her words, and Izzy saw several faces change from hostility to something that might have been respect. The young warrior who had challenged her presence looked confused, as if the medicine woman had said something unexpected. Red Hawk translated in a whisper. "She says you have the sight, that you see things others cannot." Izzy looked at him. In confusion, she had no idea what the old woman meant. But then the medicine woman spoke again, this time in heavily accented English. "You see my grandson's true heart, yes? See past warrior's mask to gentle soul beneath. This is gift, rare gift. Most people see only surface, but you see deeper." The observation was so accurate that Izzy felt her breath catch. From the moment she had met Red Hawk, she had seen something in him that others might have missed, the gentleness beneath the warrior's exterior, the protective instinct that was stronger than any desire for violence. Somehow, this elderly woman had recognized that perception as a form of strength. "My grandson says you were cast out by your people for being weak," the medicine woman continued, her eyes never leaving Izzy's face. "But I see strength, Faye. We're too blind to recognize. You survive what would kill others. You see truth where others see only lies. This is power, and power must be tested." The last words carried an ominous weight that made Izzy's heart race with new anxiety. What followed was unlike anything Izzy could have imagined. The medicine woman led her to a small fire that had been built in the center of the camp, its flames dancing in the evening light. Around the fire, various herbs and plants had been arranged in patterns that seemed to have deep significance. The smell of burning sage filled the air, and Izzy felt her senses begin to swim with the effects of the sacred smoke. "Mapa," the medicine woman said, pointing to a bundle of red leaves. "Henaway," she continued, indicating a cluster of gray-green stems. One by one, she named the plants in Cheyenne, then switched to English. "These are healing plants. Your people have doctors who cut and bleed, but our medicine comes from Earth herself. You will learn to use these gifts, to heal with your hands as well as your heart." The test began simply enough. The medicine woman would show Izzy a plant, name it, and explain its use. But as the lesson continued, something strange began to happen. Izzy found herself knowing things she couldn't possibly know. Which herbs would ease breathing? Which ones would reduce fever? Which combinations would create the most powerful healing compounds? The knowledge seemed to flow into her mind like water into a dry river bed. "Hatsamahina," the medicine woman whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Maphovahain hatsamahina." The crowd that had gathered around them stirred with excitement, and Izzy saw that even the young warrior who had challenged her was now watching with something approaching awe. Whatever was happening, it was clearly significant. As the sacred smoke continued to fill her lungs, Izzy began to feel herself drifting into a state of consciousness she had never experienced. The world around her seemed to shift and blur, and suddenly she was no longer sitting by the fire, but standing in a vast meadow filled with plants she recognized but had never seen. A figure approached her through the swirling mist, a woman with kind eyes and gentle hands. "Niaz," the figure said, and Izzy somehow understood that this was Red Hawk's sister, the one who had died in his arms. "Nemahotats, manhits saheva." The words came to her in English as if by magic. "Little bird, you are welcome here. You are needed." The figure reached out and touched Izzy's forehead, and suddenly she was filled with knowledge. She couldn't explain the names of plants, their properties, their uses in healing. When the vision ended, Izzy found herself back by the fire, but everything had changed. The hostile faces in the crowd had been replaced by expressions of wonder and respect. The medicine woman was smiling, her weathered face transformed by joy. And Red Hawk was looking at her with such pride and love that it took her breath away. "What happened?" Izzy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The medicine woman took her hands, and Izzy was surprised to find that the old woman's skin was warm and soft, filled with the same gentleness she had seen in Red Hawk. "You received gift from spirits," she said simply. "Gift of healing, gift of sight. Your people saw only weakness, but spirits see strength. You are medicine woman now, keeper of ancient knowledge, the change in the village's attitude toward." Izzy was immediate and profound. The same people who had looked at her with suspicion and hostility now approached her with reverence, bowing their heads respectfully as they passed. Children who had hidden behind their mothers' skirts now peeked out with curious eyes, and several women began to gather around her, chattering excitedly, and Cheyenne Red Hawk's pride was evident in every line of his body as he watched his people's acceptance of the woman he had chosen to protect. "I told you they would see your worth," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But even I did not expect this. You have been chosen by the spirits themselves, marked as one of our holy women. This is honor beyond anything I could have hoped for." The medicine woman, who had introduced herself as Vapa Havo-san, which meant sacred woman, began to explain what Izzy's new role would mean. "You will learn our ways of healing, our ceremonies, our sacred knowledge. But you will also bring your own gifts, your own understanding. The spirits have shown me that you will help our people in ways we cannot yet imagine." As the evening wore on, Izzy found herself at the center of a celebration that seemed to have sprung up spontaneously. Food was brought from every lodge, and the women began to prepare traditional dishes that they insisted she must try. The men started a fire dance, their movements telling stories of hunt and battle, while the children gathered around to stare at her with wide-eyed wonder. The most surprising development came when several of the village's most skilled craftsmen approached Red Hawk with what was clearly a formal proposal. They spoke in rapid Cheyenne, their hands moving expressively as they gestured toward various parts of the camp. Red Hawk's face broke into a smile that seemed to light up the entire evening. "They want to build us a lodge," he explained to Izzy. "Not just any lodge, but one worthy of a medicine woman and the warrior who protects her. They say it is their honor to provide shelter for someone the spirits have chosen." The offer was clearly significant, and Izzy could see the respect in the men's eyes as they looked at her. What followed was a flurry of activity that would have been impossible in Cedar Ridge. The entire village seemed to mobilize for the construction project, with everyone contributing according to their abilities. The women began to prepare the hide coverings, working with needles and sinew to create panels that would keep out wind and rain. The men selected the finest poles, testing each one for strength and straightness. As Izzy watched the preparations, she was struck by the fundamental difference between this community and the one she had left behind. Here, her weakness was not seen as a burden but as a sign of her special calling. Her inability to perform heavy labor was not a failing but a mark of someone set apart for sacred purposes. For the first time in her life, she was valued not despite her limitations, but because of them. As the night deepened and the celebration gradually wound down, Red Hawk led Izzy to a quiet spot beside the stream that ran through the camp. The water murmured softly in the darkness, and overhead, the stars shone with a brightness that seemed impossible in the thin mountain air. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice soft and uncertain. Despite everything that had happened, despite the miraculous acceptance she had received, he still seemed to fear that she might regret her choice. Izzy took his hand, marveling at the contrast between his warrior's strength and the gentleness with which he touched her. "I'm more than happy," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "I'm home. For the first time in my life, I'm truly home." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of searching, of trying to find her place in a world that had never seemed to want her. Here, in this valley surrounded by mountains and filled with people who saw her gifts rather than her limitations, she had found something she had never dared to hope for. Red Hawk's smile was like sunrise breaking over the peaks. "Then tomorrow we begin building our life together," he said. "The lodge they will make for us will be more than shelter. It will be the foundation of our future, the place where we will learn to be husband and wife, the home where we will raise our children in the ways of both our peoples." The promise hung in the air between them like a bridge to tomorrow, and as they sat together in the darkness, Izzy felt the last of her old fears finally beginning to fade. She was no longer the weak girl who had been cast aside by her own people. She was a medicine woman, a chosen one, someone with gifts that were valued and needed. And beside her sat the man who had seen her worth when no one else could, who had risked everything to bring her home. The sun had barely crested the mountain peaks when the sound of activity began to fill the Cheyenne village. Izzy woke to voices speaking in hushed, reverent tones, and the rhythmic sound of tools being prepared for the day's work. Through the hide walls of the temporary shelter where she had spent the night, she could hear Red Hawk's deep voice directing the construction crew with the authority of someone who had earned absolute respect. When she emerged from the lodge, wrapped in a beautiful blanket that the Pahavo-san had given her, Izzy was amazed to see that the entire village had transformed into a construction site. Men were selecting and testing lodge poles with the care of master craftsmen, while women worked in groups to prepare the massive hide coverings that would form the walls of their new home. Children ran between the workers, carrying messages and small tools, their faces bright with excitement at being part of such an important project. "Knees," Red Hawk called, his voice carrying clearly across the bustling camp. When she approached, he gestured proudly to a cleared area beside the stream where wooden stakes had been driven into the ground to mark the foundation of their future lodge. "See how they honor you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This will be the largest lodge in the village, built in the sacred circle pattern reserved for medicine women and war chiefs. You will have space for your healing work, for the ceremonies you will learn to perform." The reverence in his voice was matched by the expressions of the workers around them. These people were not simply building a house, they were creating a sacred space, a place where the spiritual and physical worlds would meet. The realization of what this meant, of the responsibility that was being placed on her shoulders, was both thrilling and terrifying. The Pahavo-san approached with a bundle of sage burning in a carved stone bowl, the sweet smoke curling around them like incense. "In our way," she explained in her careful English, "lodge is not just shelter but reflection of universe itself. Center pole represents connection between earth and sky, between world of spirits and world of flesh. 4 directions are honored in placement of entrance, sleeping area, altar space." She began to walk around the marked foundation, pointing to specific locations and explaining their significance. The entrance would face east, toward the rising sun and the source of new life. The sleeping area would be positioned in the west, where the sun set and the spirits of the ancestors waited. The north side would hold the altar space where Izzy would perform her healing ceremonies, while the south would be reserved for daily activities and the preparation of medicines. As the old woman spoke, Izzy began to understand that she was not just receiving a home, but being inducted into a way of life that was thousands of years old. Every aspect of the lodge's construction had spiritual significance, from the type of wood used for the poles to the patterns that would be painted on the hide walls. She was being given not just shelter, but a sacred trust. "Your people build square houses," the Pahavo-san continued, her weathered hands tracing the circular outline in the air. "Square is shape of earth, of limitation, of boundaries that cannot be crossed. But circle is shape of sky, of spirit, of connection that has no end. In circular lodge, all things flow together, past and future, earth and sky, weakness and strength." Construction began with a ceremony that was both beautiful and deeply moving. Red Hawk and 3 other senior warriors each took hold of one of the 4 main support poles, lifting them simultaneously while the entire village chanted in Cheyenne. The poles rose slowly, their tips reaching toward the sky like fingers seeking the touch of the divine. Izzy watched in amazement as the framework took shape with geometric precision that required no measuring tools or written plans. The builders worked from knowledge passed down through generations, their hands knowing exactly where each piece should go. Red Hawk moved among them with fluid grace, his massive frame somehow finding space in the crowded construction site, without interfering with anyone's work. Mata Hivatasi, one of the workers, called out, gesturing for Izzy to approach. The man was elderly, his face marked by decades of sun and wind, but his eyes held the bright intelligence of a master craftsman. He held out a small wooden peg, beautifully carved with symbols that seemed to dance in the morning light. Nanhivatas, he said, his voice filled with reverence. Red Hawk translated with obvious pride. He says this is the heart peg, the piece that holds all others together. He wants you to place it yourself, to make the lodge truly yours. The honor was clearly significant, and Izzy felt the weight of responsibility as she took the carved piece in her hands. The wood was warm and smooth, polished by countless touches, and seemed to pulse with life. Under the guidance of the master builder, Izzy climbed carefully onto the framework and positioned the heart peg in its designated place. The moment it clicked into position, she felt something shift in the very air around them. The lodge suddenly felt complete, unified, as if it had gone from being a collection of separate pieces to becoming a single, living entity. The cheer that went up from the assembled villagers was unlike anything Izzy had ever heard. It was not just celebration, but recognition, acknowledgement that she had officially claimed her place in their community. Women began to ululate in the traditional way, their voices rising and falling in patterns that seemed to echo the rhythms of the earth itself. Red Hawk climbed up beside her, his presence solid and reassuring on the swaying framework. Now, it is truly ours, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just mine, not just yours, but ours together. The spirits have blessed this union, and all who enter here will feel that blessing. He took her hand in his, and she felt the calluses on his palm, the strength that had protected her, the gentleness that had healed her wounded heart. From their elevated position, they could see the entire village spread out below them, and Izzy was struck by how different this community was from the one she had left behind. Here, people worked together, not from obligation, but from joy, contributing their skills and energy to create something beautiful for someone they respected. The contrast with Cedar Ridge, where every act of kindness came with a price, was stark and heartbreaking. As the framework neared completion, the women of the village began the intricate work of preparing the hide coverings. Izzy watched in fascination as they transformed raw buffalo skins into works of art, painting them with pigments made from local plants and minerals. The patterns they created were not random decorations, but visual stories, each symbol carrying meaning that had been passed down through generations. Vivo-san invited Izzy to participate in the painting process, teaching her the significance of each design. This is Morning Star, she explained, guiding Izzy's hand as she applied blue pigment to the hide. Represents hope, new beginning, light that comes after darkness. Very appropriate for Medicine Woman's Lodge. The old woman's smile was warm and encouraging, and Izzy felt a deep sense of connection to this ancient tradition. The work was painstaking and required a steady hand, but Izzy found that her years of creating delicate lacework had prepared her for this kind of precision. Under the guidance of the village's most skilled artists, she learned to create flowing patterns that seemed to move and breathe on the treated hide. Each stroke of the brush was an act of meditation, a way of pouring her hopes and dreams into the very walls of her new home. You have gift for this work, said Atseka, a young woman who had become one of Izzy's most enthusiastic teachers. Your hands know how to make beauty from simple materials. This is another form of medicine healing through art, through making world more beautiful. The compliment was casual but sincere, and Izzy felt her confidence growing with each praise. While the exterior work continued, Red Hawk began to focus on the interior arrangements. He consulted frequently with his grandmother, asking detailed questions about the proper placement of the altar area, the positioning of the sleeping robes, the location of the fire pit that would serve as the heart of their home, in our tradition. He explained to Izzy as they worked together to arrange the interior space. Home is extension of the people who live there. Everything must be in harmony, the flow of energy, the balance of sacred and practical, the connection between inner and outer worlds. His understanding of these concepts was clearly deep and instinctive, born from a lifetime of living according to these principles. The altar area that took shape in the northern section of the lodge was unlike anything Izzy had ever seen. Was not a single piece of furniture, but a carefully arranged collection of objects, each with its own significance. Sacred stones, bundles of healing herbs, carved figurines representing various spirits, and ceremonial tools were arranged in patterns that seemed to pulse with spiritual energy. This is where you will do your healing work, Red Hawk said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. Where you will call on the spirits to guide your hands, where you will prepare the medicines that will ease suffering and restore health. This space is as important as any church or temple. It is place where human and divine meet. The responsibility implicit in his words was overwhelming, but Izzy felt a deep sense of rightness about her role. As the sun began to set on the third day of construction, the lodge stood complete. The hide walls glowed golden in the evening light, their painted patterns seeming to move and dance in the flickering shadows. The interior was arranged with mathematical precision, every object placed according to ancient protocols that ensured spiritual harmony. The completion ceremony was simple but profound. The entire village gathered in a circle around the new lodge while Vepa performed a blessing ritual that involved burning sage and speaking in the old language. Her words were a prayer of protection, a request that the spirits watch over all who would live and work in this sacred space. Mop Netzi, she said, calling Red Hawk forward. Knees, she continued, gesturing for Izzy to join him. The old woman placed their hands together, then wrapped her own weathered fingers around them. Hova han sistaheva, nasests sustaheva, navejos sastaheva. Though the words were in Cheyenne, their meaning was clear. This was a blessing of their union, a formal recognition of their partnership. When the ceremony ended, Red Hawk led Izzy into their new home for the first time. The interior was warm and welcoming, lit by the soft glow of the central fire and filled with the sweet scent of sage and cedar. The sleeping area was arranged with beautiful robes and blankets, while the altar space seemed to pulse with spiritual energy. As they settled into their new home, Izzy felt a sense of completion that she had never experienced before. This was not just a place to live, but a sanctuary, a space where she could grow into the person she was meant to be. The lodge wrapped around them like a protective embrace, its circular walls creating a sense of unity and wholeness. Are you happy? Red Hawk asked, echoing the question he had posed the night before. But this time, there was no uncertainty in his voice. He could see the answer in her face, in the way she moved through the space as if she had always belonged there. Izzy smiled, reaching out to touch the painted walls that told the story of their love. I am complete, she said simply. For the first time in my life, I am exactly where I belong, with exactly the person I was meant to be with. This home is not just shelter, it is the foundation of everything we will build together. The words carried the weight of absolute certainty, and Red Hawk's answering smile was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. As they prepared for sleep in their new home, surrounded by the gifts and blessings of an entire community, Izzy reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had been cast aside by her own people for being too weak, too fragile, too different. But in this place, among these people, she had found not just acceptance, but reverence. Not just shelter, but a sacred calling. The girl who had once been considered worthless had become a medicine woman, a keeper of ancient wisdom, a bridge between worlds. And tomorrow she would begin the work of learning to use her gifts in service of others, guided by the love of a man who had seen her worth when no one else could. 6 months had passed since Izzy's arrival in the Cheyenne village, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The frail girl who had once struggled to climb a simple mountain trail now moved through the camp with purpose and confidence, her medicine bag slung across her shoulder and her hands steady as she tended to the sick and wounded. The thin mountain air that had once left her gasping now filled her lungs with the sweetness of home. On this particular morning, she knelt beside the sleeping form of Matsunehi, a young warrior who had been brought to her 3 days earlier, with a fever that the traditional healers had been unable to break. Under Vepa Hivosen's guidance, Izzy had learned to combine the ancient Cheyenne healing practices with insights that seemed to come from some deeper source within her. Nezavahos, she whispered to the unconscious man, her voice carrying the authority she had never possessed in her old life. Mapen Nanos. The Cheyenne words came naturally now, as if she had been born speaking them. Her hands moved over the warrior's burning skin, finding the pressure points that would help his body release the fever's grip. The healing session was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, their hoofbeats urgent and discordant against the peaceful morning rhythm of the camp. Red Hawk appeared in the doorway of their lodge, his expression grim with concern. "White soldiers," he said simply. "They come under flag of truce, but they are many, and they are armed." The news sent a chill through Izzy's heart. She had always known this day might come. The delegation that entered the village was led by Captain James Morrison, a weather-beaten cavalry officer whose eyes held the hardness of a man who had seen too much frontier violence. Behind him rode a dozen mounted soldiers, their uniforms dusty from hard travel and their hands never far from their weapons. But it was the civilian who rode beside the captain that made Izzy's blood run cold. Thomas Morrison, the blacksmith's son who had spotted them during their escape. "We're looking for a white woman," Captain Morrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of the United States Army. "Isadora Crane, daughter of Marcus Crane of Cedar Ridge. She was taken from her home by hostile Indians 6 months ago, and we have reason to believe she's being held in this camp." The accusation hung in the air like a poison cloud, and Izzy felt the tension in the village rise to dangerous levels. Red Hawk stepped forward, his massive frame radiating controlled menace. "You speak of taking," he said, his English clear despite his accent. "But woman came willingly. She chose to leave life of suffering for life of honor. She is medicine woman now, valued member of our people." His words were met with scoffs from the soldiers, men who had been taught to see Indians as savages incapable of civilization. No white woman would choose to live among savages. Thomas Morrison interjected, his voice thick with contempt. "She's obviously been coerced, probably threatened or worse. We've come to take her home where she belongs." The young man's eyes searched the crowd, looking for any sign of the woman he had seen fleeing with the Indian warrior. Izzy stepped out from behind the group of village women where she had been concealed, and the effect on the soldiers was immediate and shocking. The frail, sickly girl they had expected to find was gone, replaced by a confident young woman whose skin glowed with health and whose eyes held depths of wisdom they had never seen before. She wore traditional Cheyenne clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and around her neck hung the sacred necklace that marked her as a medicine woman. "Thomas," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Captain Morrison, I am Isadora Crane, and I am exactly where I choose to be." The statement was simple, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. The soldiers stirred uneasily, clearly having expected to find a cowering captive rather than this composed and obviously healthy woman. Captain Morrison's expression shifted from confidence to confusion. "Miss Crane, your father has been searching for you for months. He's sick with worry, convinced that you've been kidnapped or killed. We've come to bring you home." The appeal to family loyalty was calculated to break her resolve, but Izzy felt only a distant sadness for the pain her father must be experiencing. "My father is a good man," she said, her voice carrying no anger or bitterness. "But the life he offered me was a slow death disguised as safety. Here, I have found purpose, respect, and love. I am a healer now, Captain. I have saved lives, eased suffering, and contributed something meaningful to a community that values my gifts. Can you say the same about what awaited me in Cedar Ridge?" The question was pointed and unanswerable. Thomas Morrison's face flushed with anger at her words. "You've been brainwashed," he snarled. "Turned against your own people by savage witchcraft. Look at yourself dressed like a squaw, speaking their heathen tongue, living in sin with that monster." He gestured toward Red Hawk with obvious disgust. "You're a disgrace to your race and your upbringing." The insult was more than Red Hawk could bear. With a roar of fury, he stepped toward the mounted man, his hand moving to his war hatchet. But Izzy's voice stopped him cold. "Namhivatasi," she said sharply, using the Cheyenne word for wait. Then, switching to English, "He is not worth your anger, my husband. Let me handle this." The casual way she used the word husband sent another shock through the soldiers. "You married this savage?" Captain Morrison asked, his voice incredulous. "Miss Crane, surely you understand that such a union has no legal standing in civilized society. You can return home, put this unfortunate episode behind you, and find a proper husband among your own people." The condescension in his tone was thick enough to cut with a knife. Izzy's laugh was gentle but filled with genuine amusement. "Civilized. Society cast me aside as worthless, Captain. They were preparing to ship me off to California like unwanted cargo. This savage saw value in me when my own people saw only burden. He built me a home, gave me a purpose, and loved me for who I am rather than condemning me for who I'm not. Which of us is truly civilized?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. What happened next was something that would be talked about in military circles for years to come. A commotion arose from the edge of the village as several warriors carried in a man who had been badly injured in a hunting accident. His leg was bent at an impossible angle. Blood was pouring from a head wound, and he was unconscious from shock and pain. Without hesitation, Izzy moved to the injured man's side, her hands already reaching for the medicine bag at her waist. She worked with swift efficiency, her movements precise and confident, as she cleaned the wounds, set the broken bone, and applied healing poultices made from plants she had gathered and prepared herself. The soldiers watched in fascination as she chanted in Cheyenne, her voice carrying a power that seemed to come from some source beyond the physical world. Within minutes, the man's breathing became easier, the bleeding stopped, and color began to return to his face. He opened his eyes and spoke weakly in Cheyenne, his words clearly expressing gratitude and relief. The transformation was so dramatic that several of the soldiers unconsciously removed their hats, as if they were witnessing something sacred. "This is what I do," Izzy said, rising from beside the healed man. "This is who I am. I am a healer, a medicine woman, someone who brings comfort to the suffering and hope to the hopeless. Your civilization wanted to discard me because I was too weak to be useful. This culture honors me because my weakness led me to discover different strengths." Her words carried the weight of lived experience. Captain Morrison reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a folded letter, its edges worn from handling. "Your father asked me to give you this," he said, his voice softer now. "He wanted you to know that he understands your choice, even if he doesn't agree with it. He says to tell you that he loves you, and that you will always have a home with him if you change your mind. The gesture was clearly difficult for the military man, who had expected this to be a simple rescue mission. Izzy took the letter with trembling hands, her eyes filling with tears as she read her father's carefully written words. Marcus Crane had poured his heart onto the page, expressing his love for his daughter while acknowledging that he had failed to protect her from the cruelty of their community. He wrote of his pride in her strength, his admiration for her courage, and his hope that she had found the happiness that had always eluded her in Cedar Ridge. "He says he's proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He says he knew I would find my way to where I belonged, and that he's glad I had the courage to choose my own path." The letter was a gift of love and understanding, a father's blessing on a daughter's brave decision to forge her own destiny. Read. Hawk moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and comforting. "Your father is wise man," he said simply. "He sees what these soldiers cannot, that strength takes many forms, and that love means letting go when holding on would cause pain." His words carried the wisdom of someone who understood the complexity of human relationships. Captain Morrison made one last attempt to convince her to return. "Miss Crane, I have orders to bring you back to civilization. The territorial government considers you a kidnapping victim, and they won't accept that you came willingly. If you refuse to return, they'll send a larger force to retrieve you, and there will be bloodshed." The threat was real, and everyone present understood the implications, but Izzy's response was immediate and unwavering. "Then tell the territorial government that Isadora Crane died 6 months ago in the wilderness," she said firmly. "The woman who stands before you is Nai's medicine woman of the Cheyenne people. I have no desire to return to a world that never wanted me, and I will not be the cause of violence between our peoples." Her words carried the finality of a door closing forever. She turned to address the assembled soldiers directly. "Look at me," she said, her voice carrying across the silent camp. "Really look at me. Do I appear to be a prisoner? Do I seem afraid or coerced? I am healthier, happier, and more useful than I ever was in your civilization. I have found love, purpose, and respect among people you call savages. What more could any woman ask for?" The question was rhetorical, but it hung in the air like a challenge to everything the soldiers thought they knew about civilization and savagery. The soldiers prepared to leave, their mission a failure, but their understanding forever changed. They had expected to find a cowering victim, and instead discovered a confident woman who had found her place in the world. Even Thomas Morrison seemed subdued by the encounter, his preconceptions shattered by the reality of what he had witnessed. As the cavalry rode away, Izzy felt a sense of completion that was both profound and peaceful. She had faced her past and chosen her future, had stood up to the forces that would have dragged her back to a life of slow decay. The girl who had once been too weak to climb a mountain trail had found the strength to defy an entire civilization. Red. Hawk wrapped his arms around her from behind, his embrace warm and protective. "You are free," he whispered into her hair. "Truly free. No one can take you from this place, from this life, from me." His words were a promise and a celebration, acknowledgement that their love had survived its greatest test. As the sun set over the Cheyenne village, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Izzy stood in the doorway of the lodge that Red Hawk had built for her. The structure was more than a home. It was a symbol of love's power to transform lives, to create something beautiful from the broken pieces of the past inside. The altar space glowed with the light of sacred candles, and the smell of healing herbs filled the air. This was her sanctuary, her place of power, the foundation of a life she had never dared to dream possible. The weak girl who had been cast aside by her own people had become a medicine woman, a healer, a bridge between worlds. "Nemahotats," Red Hawk said, using the Cheyenne word for my beloved. "Sihieno ahaze. Sihieno ahaze hovahin." The words needed no translation. They were a declaration of love, A promise of forever, a recognition that they had found in each other what the world had tried to deny them. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Izzy reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had been discarded like broken glass for being too fragile to survive the frontier, but she had not only survived, she had thrived. The weakness that her old world had seen as a failing had become the foundation of a different kind of strength, one that healed rather than destroyed, that built rather than torn down. The girl who had once been nobody had become somebody precious, somebody valued, somebody loved. And in the lodge that a towering Cheyenne warrior had built for her with his own hands, she had found not just shelter but sanctuary, not just acceptance but reverence, not just a home but a destiny. The circle was complete, the story fulfilled. The weak made strong through the transformative power of love that sees beyond surface appearances to the truth that lies beneath. In a world that had cast her aside, she had found her place. In a culture that valued her gifts, she had discovered her purpose. And in the arms of a man who had seen her worth when no one else could, she had found her home.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.